Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 162. This week the questions are taken from Guide 217, the guide to HMS Berwick, and the accompanying Wednesday video on the Guadalcanal campaign, the Battle of Santa Cruz. Dejan Gabrovsek asks, why did pre-dreadnoughts and early dreadnoughts have such poor anti-torpedo protection? Torpedoes and mines were not a new thing around 1900. There's two major factors involved, one of which is the torpedoes, the other of which is the ships. So, firstly, pre-dreadnoughts will always appear to have somewhat less torpedo protection than later dreadnoughts and such like, because they are physically smaller ships. So if you put the same size hull in an ironclad or pre-dreadnought, which might range in 10 to 15,000, maybe slightly more tons, as opposed to that same hull in a dreadnought that's 25 to 30,000 tons, well, that hull is proportionally bigger in the smaller ship, and if you admit 1,000 tons of water, that might be 10% the displacement of an ironclad, whereas it might be 3 or 4% the displacement of a super-dreadnought. And so the effects are going to be considerably more. And also because they're smaller, they physically can't fit as deep a torpedo defense system as some later ships can. That's one side of things. The other side of things is that torpedoes actually advance quite quickly. So not just in warhead size, but also in the power of the explosive aboard each torpedo. In the late 1800s going into the 1900s, your typical torpedo might be carrying 100 pounds, give or take, of gun cotton, which has a certain amount of explosive power, but ships can be designed against that. Coal bunkers can provide protection. Torpedoes run fairly shallow at that point, so even hitting the belt armour is a possibility, and the belt armour can withstand 100 pounds of gun cotton relatively easily. And so if you did launch a 100-pound warhead torpedo at a pre-dreadnought from 1899, it would be damaged, but you'd probably need more than one hit to sink it. Whereas torpedoes move over from gun cotton to TNT during the 1900s, which is firstly a problem, and secondly, the amount of explosives in them jumps quite dramatically. So by World War I, which is when you start to see pre-dreadnoughts getting hit by torpedoes quite often, then all of a sudden you're talking about torpedoes that might be carrying, in some cases, well over 500 pounds of TNT. So not only have you got a considerably more powerful explosive, but you've also got 5 times the explosive. Even if it was gun cotton, that would still be a massive, massive issue. And torpedo defense systems are generally rated against a certain weight of explosive. So as I say, with some coal bunkers and a few ambitions that it might hit the belt armour, making sure you're using a double bottom and some bulkheads might be all that you need to stop a 100-pound gun cotton torpedo. But if that same ship is hit 15 years after it's designed by a 500-pound warhead torpedo that's using TNT, that's going to blow straight through all of those systems and cause massive damage on a relatively small, for a capital ship, vessel. Bill Anazari asks, why did the Royal Navy not build any heavy cruisers after the York class? Priorities and naval treaties, effectively. The number and type of cruisers had been further restricted by the London Naval Treaty, and so the Royal Navy, since it had to protect the British Empire, decided it needed the maximum number of cruisers more than it needed individually powerful units. And so you got a run of the Leanders, the Arethusas, and then once they realised other people were building heavy cruisers, they started to get a little bit worried about that. They started building the Town class because the rapid-fire 6-inch had come in. So there was a working theory that, rapid-fire 6-inch guns could overwhelm a similar size, i.e. 10,000-ton cruiser, with fewer slower-firing 8-inch guns. But they were also looking at new heavy cruiser designs, because remember, they thought the war was going to come in 41 or 42, maybe 43 if they were lucky. And on that basis, they were looking into new heavy cruisers once they'd completed the run of the Town class. But obviously war intervened and they weren't able to build them. So the first one that they were looking at was the Surrey type, which was a derivative of the County class, or the last County subclass that was built. And obviously, as you can see, I'm using the World of Warships version here because, well, it's a good 3D model of what might have been. And the other thing was also looking at how complete their cruiser fleet was. Because of the County class production, they actually had quite a lot of heavy cruisers, and under the treaty, there were certain limits to what you could do with that. The U.S. Navy was in a similar boat, although they built smaller individual classes as opposed to the fairly large run that the counties had. The New Orleans class is a design that is actually a late 1920s design. The design is finally locked in 1930, and then the ships are ordered. So even though they're built in the 30s, it is a 20s design, and most of the 1930s, likewise, the US is building the Brooklyns, the Atlantas, which are roughly analogous to the Didos and the Towns in the Royal Navy, so they're building light cruisers as well. Apart from the one off Wichita, it's not until World War II starts in Europe that you start to see the next generation of US heavy cruisers, which is the Baltimore class. And when you look at other navies, the other navies are filling up what they are allocated. So the Japanese are filling up on heavy cruisers because they don't have as many as built as the British and the Americans do in the 20s. And the Italians, the French, and the Germans are all effectively rebuilding their entire cruiser fleet near enough. And so they're building heavy cruisers in the 30s. But, let's say, the British and the Americans, they already have a bunch of pretty decent ones from the 1920s. Michelangelo Buonarroti, I think, asks, what is your opinion of the Italian Francesco Caracciolo class super-dreadnoughts? Was there any possibility of getting the lead ship completed? Did the Italians have a real chance of making her into a carrier, and if so, what would she have looked like, and what impact would she have made in World War II? Finally, do you think that scrapping the remaining pre-dreadnoughts and the ironclad Sardenga, as well as many of the older cruisers earlier, would have freed up enough budget, and was that a terrible option? As a concept, I like them. I mean, in a lot of ways, if they'd been completed, they would have been a fast battleship before anybody else had a fast battleship. Okay, the armour for a ship that's mounting 15-inch guns is a little bit sparse at just under 12 inches, but it's got 8 15-inch guns, so that puts it competitive with pretty much anything else that's been built in World War I, and it's 28 knots. And, 28 knots and 15-inch gun armament might sound very familiar to you, because that is pretty much the armor and the speed and armament combination that you find in a lot of 1930s fast battleships. Okay, some of them go a little bit faster, some have more armor, some have bigger, well, one or two have bigger guns once the escalator clause is invoked, some have smaller guns, because they were trying to follow the London Second Naval Treaty. But, all of that aside, on paper, they would have been pretty good ships, and I do like the concept and the overall design idea. The details I'm not quite as sold on. As you can see here, they have the 4 twin turrets quite heavily spaced. That I don't think is a particularly brilliant idea. I know there are reasons why they went for that, but it does unnecessarily extend the citadel a little, in my opinion, and that means that, well, you've got a slightly thinner armor belt, and as you can see from that side profile, it's not the highest of armor belts either. So if I was in charge of the design project, as much as the machinery required to get me up to 28 knots will allow, I would try and put those super-firing turrets in more traditional close-up super-firing pairs, thus shortening the overall citadel length. And, I mean, to be honest, 28 knots for a battleship in World War I is far more than enough. You're effectively building a battle cruiser by speed. So again, fast battleship origins. And so you don't need extra speed with the saved weight, so I would put that into extra armour. And if I can use that to buy myself an extra inch or two of armour, then, well, effectively I've got a Queen Elizabeth only, 3-4 knots faster, which is fantastic. So I'd say on a sort of score out of 10, I would give them maybe a 7.5 out of 10. Excellent concept, very good on paper capabilities, but could have been designed a bit better. As far as possibilities of getting the lead ship completed, well, she was launched eventually at the end of after World War II, but Italy had a lot of budgetary problems, and this would only go on to get worse because, I mean, they did relatively quickly scrap all of their older ships, and then towards the end of the 1920s they even got rid of Dante Alighieri, and then they decided to give up on trying to repair Leonardo da Vinci. So you've got a launched hull, you only have the fitting out stage to do. So yes, in theory you could have made some savings if you had, as you suggest, ditched a lot of the older ships a little bit earlier. Maybe even got rid of Dante ASAP, which would have stung a little bit, but the cost recovered from that and the lack of maintenance costs might just have paid to have Francesco Italian Caracciolo. Oh, I had it right at the beginning. Caracciolo. Anyway, Francesco, we're calling him. Could have completed Francesco with all that money saved. Then you could probably then make an argument, well, we're exchanging a one-off ship that is now the least powerful of our dreadnoughts for a one-off ship that's the most powerful of our dreadnoughts, because you've got the Andrea Dorias and the Conte de Cavours as two ship classes. So yeah, that could have been a thing as a possibility. And of course, as you said, they were looking at maybe converting it into a carrier. Again, weirdly enough, probably would have made a half-decent carrier. It certainly got the speed as a basis, and taking off the guns and some of the armour would have upped the speed. Obviously, you lose a bit for sticking on the hangar deck and flight deck, but overall, you probably would have got 29-30 knots out of the ship quite comfortably. About the only major issue you'd run into is that 28 knots or not, she is still a battleship, so she's shorter even than Kaga, and definitely shorter than Furious, Courageous, Glorious, Lexington, Saratoga, Akagi, etc., all the sort of battlecruiser conversions. So, although she would have been competitive in speed, I don't think she'd have been that competitive in air group. She probably would have been more along the lines of HMS Eagle, which ex-Almirante Cochrane, which is about the same size. She just would have been a bit quicker. So the air group would have been somewhat limited, and although it would have given Italy fairly good experience in operating aircraft carriers, her effect in World War II, I think, could be important. It would depend where she was sailing, because as a single carrier, you're not going to be able to guarantee that you've got that carrier either in service all the time, because obviously it needs repairs and maintenance, or even in the specific theatre or in the specific operation all the time. For example, in the engagements that run up to the night action of Cape Matapan, this kind of ship as a carrier supporting the Italian fleet, well, one, it could have kept up, which is good, but two, if it had been there with some fighters, it could have broken up the British air attacks, which might then have meant that Polo wasn't disabled. So that's good for the Italians, but equally, it might not have been assigned to that operation. It might have been in refit, it might have been in repair, it might have been sunk at Taranto, it might have been being prepared for some other operation, and to be honest, given the Mediterranean, it's also entirely possible that with a relatively small complement of aircraft and the fact the British do have night attack capability, she might have been hit and crippled early on in the war. This is the problem with only having the one carrier. There's so many variables going on. Everything from she might have had a really good war record right up to she might have been sunk in the first 3 months of the war. George Davidson asks, had the Bofors and Oerlikon not existed, what in your opinion would have made up the AA defences on Allied ships late in the war, and how effective would these alternate systems have been against the gold standard of the Bofors-Oerlikon? For the light anti-aircraft solution, instead of the 20mm Oerlikon, I suspect the U.S. Navy would have soldiered on with ironing out the issues with the 1.1 inch for a while, And on the British side of things, pretty much the only candidate I can think of in that sort of caliber region would be to take production of the Hispano-Suzuya HS-404 20mm gun, i.e. the 20mm cannon that was used in a lot of aircraft, and turn that into an anti-aircraft mount, as was actually done later on in the war. So I suspect that probably would have occurred slightly earlier, an accelerated program, and at that point, once they come up with the idea, they would have said, hey, Americans, you with the big factories and the love of all things that go pew pew, 20mm anti-aircraft mount that's not awful. At which point the Americans, like they did with the 20mm Oerlikon, would have gone, yes, that's nice, we'll make 100,000. As for the performance difference between an Oerlikon 20mm and an HS-404 based anti-aircraft mount, I don't know enough about either gun to make a direct comparison, but I suspect the performance gap probably wouldn't have been too awful in being far apart. And to be perfectly honest, by the late war, even the 20 mils were being supplanted by longer range and heavier AA anyway, which brings us on to the main event. There is really only one existing candidate for the 40mm medium weight AA in the Allied navies that comes even close to being acceptable, and that is the pom-pom. Yes, it has its issues, but it has its benefits, and as we've mentioned in other dry docks, the U.S. Navy did come relatively close to adopting it. It was sort of a close second to the 40mm Bofors in the Navy's design considerations, and of course the British would be using the pom-pom all the way through the war. So I suspect if the 40mm Bofors is not available, then given that, again, it's a pre-existing thing, yes, it requires some adaptation, but that's easier than designing a whole new thing from scratch that might not actually work. I think, again, the US Navy would have gone, you know what, okay, yeah, your 40mm rounds use cordite, etc. We don't necessarily like that, but we're going to sort of bite the bullet, almost literally, and re-engineer aspects of the breech and the ammunition on the pom-pom for American-made ammunition. And yes, it's going to take a little bit of time, but hey, they had to strip down, reassemble, and effectively do minor redesign work on the 40mm Bofors anyway, at which point, yeah, everyone would have been using 40mm pom-poms, and you'd probably see some improved variants thereof, because I strongly suspect that, well, if they're going to be redoing the breech and they're going to be redoing the ammo, someone in America is going to be tinkering with it to try and get it to shoot further and faster as well. So, yeah, you would have had quad, octuple, and twin pom-poms floating around instead of the 40mm Bofors. Now, assuming we discard any hypothetical longer range version of the pom-pom as something that will probably be produced, but obviously we'll never know what capabilities it would have had, and we stick with the high velocity ammunition performance of the pom-poms in the latter part of World War II, it's a little bit of a swings and roundabout situation, in as much as we do have direct comparisons of the two 40mm systems, and the pom-pom per gun overall was outperformed by the 40mm Bofors because the Bofors could reach out and touch people at longer distances. However, specifically in the late war, when it comes up to dealing with kamikazes, who tend to come in obviously fairly close and are rather determined, the 40mm pom-pom actually did start to show some advantages over the Bofors, mainly on the grounds of the fact that it had a very long sustained firing cycle because of those massive magazines you can see on the sides, which is very useful for a slightly prolonged engagement when someone's trying to ram themselves into you. And secondly, because it came not just in quad but also in octuple flavours, octuple pom-poms were especially good at taking apart kamikazes, simply because, 8 barrels, you just empty a mag dump 8 barrels of 40mm ammunition into a kamikaze that's coming at you, you can effectively just erode it from the sky and turn it into confetti. Whereas even a 40mm Bofors hit, while it was pretty powerful, would cripple an aircraft, it would go down in flames, but it might, it was trying to do that anyway. It's just a matter of where it hit. Whereas if you manage to get your crosshairs from 8 guns as opposed to 4 or 2 on an incoming kamikaze, you could literally remove it from existence. So in specifically the late war, especially with the likely alterations that would have been made against kamikazes, I think the pom-pom would have actually done very well. But more generally against, attackers that might actually want to live, it might not have done it well. It wouldn't have done quite as well as the 40mm Bofors. We know that much from the side-by-side comparisons, but it still would have done a reasonable job. Mancub WMA asks, what do you think would happen if the Dunkerques were in British ports during France's surrender and were seized by the Royal Navy? How would they be used, given that they don't quite fit in the Royal Navy lineup, but are too big an asset to ignore? Would they be allocated to the free navies? How would their upgrades and refits look? Would they change the anti-aircraft batteries? And where would they get the main gun ammunition from? So if we're talking about the ships actually being under British military control by the end of things, similar to what happened to some of the French ships that were in, when I say British ports, I mean UK ports, as opposed to, say, the French ships in Alexandria, which were talked into standing down rather than seized by the British. So if they're in British hands, as you say, they are far, far too big an asset to be ignored. But equally, the Royal Navy is going to have all sorts of merry hell trying to operate them themselves. So I don't think they actually would. What they're almost certainly going to do, given that first they've got to figure out what on earth it is they've actually got, is, as you say, you mentioned the free navies. I can't see the Free French, especially de Gaulle, doing anything other than going completely apoplectic if the Royal Navy turned around and said, you know what, Free Polish Navy, have a Dunkirk. Much as the Free Polish Navy would love a Dunkirk, yeah, I can't see de Gaulle really going for that. What I can see potentially happening is some of the crew might decide they actually want to stay on and fight the Germans. And given the asset that these ships represent, I suspect that pretty much any and all other French sailors from French merchant ships or from other French warships that joined the Free French Navy would just be pulled to make up the necessary numbers and expertise to ensure that these things stay in action. Because even if that means you've got Free French cruisers and destroyers, etc., lined up on the dockside or handed over to other free navies, both from a Free French national pride perspective and also from a Royal Navy, which asset is the most valuable perspective, if every single Free French crewman in existence is concentrated on Dunkirk and Strasbourg, the Royal Navy is going to go for that above and beyond anything else. At which point, the question is, where do you actually deploy them? That's a little bit of an interesting one. I suspect that they will probably be deployed in one of two areas, depending on how politics works out. Militarily, it makes the most sense to deploy them to the Mediterranean. There's more fast capital ship threats that the Dunkirk and Strasbourg are more uniquely suited to deal with in the Mediterranean than in the North Atlantic. Because let's face it, they're never going to stand up to Bismarck, so there's no point doing that. They might keep them around for a little bit because of, whilst Scharnhorst and her sister are the main threats, because especially Strasbourg does stand a fairly decent fighting chance against them, and again, they're fast enough to catch up or keep up with the Scharnhorsts. But once you've got the Channel Dash and Bismarck is now the primary threat, I suspect that once Prince of Wales, maybe even Duke of York is online, you'd see the Dunkirks put into the Mediterranean theatre. Anti-aircraft gun-wise, yeah, they're probably going to be refitted with 4-inch anti-aircraft guns to simplify ammunition loadouts, because 5.1 inch is not a caliber that the Royal Navy has or is going to produce in any significant numbers, and you would need significant numbers because they're anti-aircraft guns. When it comes to the main guns, I think you'd see a situation similar to what happened with Richelieu when it got refitted. In that particular case, the US was persuaded to set up a short-term production line to produce a bunch of compatible shells. In this case, I think the British would have to produce a short-term batch run of 13-inch shells to ensure that they're kept in main gun ammunition. Because again, yes, it's difficult, yes, it's costly, but the alternative is two comfortably battle cruisers, two fairly capable battle cruisers, if not battleships. I'm not entirely sold on calling them battleships, but anyway, two fairly powerful capital assets. You go through a fair bit to keep those things active, especially in the early to mid part of World War II. Luke Dogwalker asks, which is the more efficient gun layout? 3 triples in the traditional 2 fore 1 aft, or 2 triples with 2 twins super firing? And does the efficiency of either vary with caliber and weight? E.g., one is better for cruisers, the other is better for battleships. 3 triples is always the better solution if you can actually fit it. There are a few ships that didn't do this. The Nevada class being an example, the Pensacola class being another example, and there's a few others in other navies as well. But these are the products of restrictions in your hull, whether that be in overall size or in width of the hull. So on the Pensacolas, physically not wide enough forward to have a triple. You have to have a twin, otherwise the magazine and the barbette is going to be basically right next to, or even depending on the exact design sketch, possibly even protruding slightly from the hull, which is not good. With the Nevadas, it's a case of displacement limitations rather than hull size limitations. The U.S. Navy would dearly have liked to have 4 triples. They just weren't allowed to on the budget and hull size that they were given for the Nevadas. There are a number of issues comparing 3 triples with 2 triples and 2 twins. Yeah, you get 1 gun extra with the mixed arrangement, but it means you've got to incorporate the weight and the space of 2 entire twin turrets. So 2 entire turrets worth of armor, 2 entire turrets worth of barbette, and all the magazines, hoists, etc. associated with that. Individually, they're less than a triple. Combined, they're considerably more than a triple. So you end up paying a huge amount of weight penalty in order to attain a single barrel extra. Whereas with your 3 triple design, you've got a shorter citadel, so for the same weight you can have more armor. You're saving weight as well, so with that saved weight you can have more armor or more speed. So if you have let's say you have 2 ships that are restricted to the same budget and the same weight limits into displacement and size, etc. If you design a ship with 2 triples and 2 twins, and you design a ship with 3 triples, the 3 triple ship will almost certainly be more heavily protected and faster, or incredibly more heavily protected and the same speed, or same protection and ridiculously faster on those same overall displacement limits. It's only when you get a ship where you, or a displacement where and stability level where you physically cannot have a uniform battery in terms of what kind of turret you're using, that you'll end up with these kind of split arrangements. Bredley asks, what weapons were navies worried about that didn't exist or weren't as effective as they thought they were? There were rafts and rafts of these things. I mean, the reason I'm showing the Mackinsons here is because the development of HMS Hood was driven in large part by reports the Royal Navy received that suggested the Mackinsons would have 15-inch guns. In fact, they didn't have 15-inch guns. They weren't intended to have, although weirdly enough, the results of the Battle of Jutland and various other things meant that the Ersatz Yorks, the follow-ons, would, but the British ended up building in response to a weapon that, at that point, in battlecruisers, didn't exist on the enemy side. You also have, again, with the British, the B bomb, which I've covered before. And no, that's not a bomb that drops killer bees on you. It's a so-called buoyant bomb. The idea being you drop the bomb ahead of the target, and then because the bomb is positively buoyant, under, obviously, its inertia, it will go down into the water, but then it will pop back up again underneath the ship and detonate underneath it with basically the effect of a mine, a keel-breaking mine. It was a very good idea in theory, and it turned out not to work quite so well in practice, but the British were operating under the assumption that, well, if we have it, surely someone else has also thought about it. So a lot of design work in the 1930s, in everything up to and including King George V class battleships, included protection against this kind of weapon, which turned out actually to be a relatively good idea because it meant that they had more protection against things like magnetically fused torpedoes and magnetic mines and the like to a certain degree, but the German B-bomb didn't actually exist. For a period in the Pacific Campaign, the Americans were worried about a theoretical, super stealthy, super fast underwater Japanese submarine that was able to sneak into fleet engagements and torpedo them. That made the rounds in various intel evaluation circles for a bit. And then obviously eventually it turned out that in fact no, there were not super secret, super stealthy submarines that were sneaking in the middle of high-speed naval battles to drop torpedoes on American cruisers and such. Like, it was in fact just the fact Long Lance had a fairly long range. And another one which had a lot of work put into countering it and was quite badly feared by once they realised what was going on was the Fritz X. But strangely enough, actually, for all the hype that it gets, when you look at the numbers deployed, wasn't actually that effective. I mean, yeah, it's a fairly big weapon. It's a 3,000-pound weapon. If you get hit by a 3,000-pound armor-penetrating bomb, bad things are going to happen to you. But when you look at the actual numbers of warships hit and numbers of warships sunk by the Fritz X, considering that well over 1,000 of them were produced, they weren't actually as effective as people tend to think. They've got the big headlines: sinking Roma, badly damaging Warspite, but actually overall the number of ships even damaged, let alone sunk by Fritz X, is pretty low. Its kind of heyday is almost entirely around the Salerno landings, because it goes into use before then but doesn't have a tremendous amount of success as they're getting used to it. And once the Allies cotton on to what's going on after the Salerno campaign, you have jammers deployed, which messes with the ability to guide the things in the first place, and also the aircraft that are launching them are pretty vulnerable as well. So much as it's touted as a sort of a wonder weapon, it's not actually that impressive compared to something like the HS-293. Arguably, that's actually a far more effective weapon of the two. Bay Reese asks, why do you think the U.S. Congress, for the most part of U.S. Navy history, never gave them the funding they needed, and how did it affect U.S. Naval Doctrine? Politics. Isn't it fun? In an objective sense, because we are talking about the 19th century, so I think we can, and early 20th, so we can discuss it with a certain degree of historical objectivity. It comes down to a few things. One, the US was not the economic powerhouse that everybody thinks about in sort of 20th century terms for a good chunk of the 19th century. So the money simply wasn't there to build a fleet in the 19th century that could challenge everybody else. The US simply just didn't have that amount of money, nor in fact did it have its industry, although I suppose if you're throwing lots of money at it, eventually the industry will develop. You've also got a kind of a three-part political problem. One, the US as a whole, the general public as well as the political parties that reflect them, was very isolationist during the 19th century for the most part, and indeed going into the early part of the 20th century. If the public don't want you to be involved in overseas affairs, then you don't need an ocean-going fleet, and therefore you're not really going to be able to persuade anybody to pass bills to support an ocean-going fleet. Secondly, there, as in a lot of countries, but there was a certain degree of, after an election, the previous party has done this, we are the other party, we don't like the first party, therefore we're going to cancel what the first party has done, almost regardless of whether or not it's a good idea, simply because the other party has done it. And then we're going to, after having wasted all that money and done a few studies and spoken to a few people who will gladly accept contracts and donate to our party instead, we will restart the entire process a year or two down the line, having wasted all the time and money that was put into the previous effort, and now, now we're going to start from the ground up, and it's going to cost even more money to produce something that is now probably going to be out of date by the time we've produced it, and then they lose power, and the cycle happens over again. That's not a uniquely US thing, by the way. It does happen all over the place. And thirdly, it kind of ties into the isolationism issue, practicality. For a good chunk of the 19th century, the USA was still establishing, what the territorial boundaries and ambitions of the USA were going to be. And they didn't really want other people come poking in that area. And one of the best ways to, provoke people to come poking at you is to go poking them. So the U.S. Congress, realizing this to a degree, didn't want the US generally going abroad poking around at things when the money could be invested into developing things internally within the US and, not having other people coming in for retaliatory pokings. This combined with the fact that the British Empire kind of liked having its West Indies or Caribbean colonies, and also didn't really want other European nations poking around the American continent, well, the North American or South American continent. You had this sort of conflation where the US didn't want anyone coming into their territory. The Royal Navy didn't want anyone going into that territory either. But because the Royal Navy was already the global navy, they were actually relatively happy to enforce that on everybody else. And to a certain extent, the US Congress looked at it and went, well, if someone else is already paying to keep most foreign interests away from our shores and the areas that we want to have interests in near our shores, why should we pay to duplicate that work? They might go away and then we'd have to pay for it all. So it's a combination of all those factors. And you see this sometimes even when sort of going government to government. Specifically, I'm thinking about the 1910s going into the 1920s. So under the Wilson administration, you get the Two Ocean Navy Act, or early equivalent thereof, and you've got this pledge the U.S. Navy is going to be second to none, and you get this massive building program, which is the root of things like the Lexington battlecruisers and the South Dakota 1920 battleships. But by the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, that party's out of power, new party's in power, new party is more isolationist, and doesn't want the arms race. So it is sometimes a little bit misleading to say, oh, well, America could have or would have built XYZ as follow-ons to the Lexingtons and South Dakotas. Yes, technically speaking, and from an industrial perspective, they could. Politically speaking, they really didn't want to, and probably wouldn't, because the new party didn't think that this was a good idea. So everything had kind of gone on hold. So this is kind of the many layers of problems with the U.S. Congress. And plus, of course, the fact that for a lot of that period, shipbuilding and the associated industries for it are mostly concentrated around the coast. And so if you vote to spend a lot of money on, industries and factories that are based on the coast, that means only certain states benefit, which means other state senators who are more interior or don't have major shipbuilding industries are not likely to vote for it because they want that money for their own people. Josh Thomas Moore asks, if Admiral King makes an unkind comment about the Royal Navy and Jackie Fisher is in the room and hears the comment, who wins the fist fight and how much destruction will be caused? Both men are in their prime, and no weapons like pistols and swords are allowed, although improvised weapons from the room may be allowed. Well, it's going to be absolutely vicious, but I think I'm probably going to give a slight edge to Admiral Fisher. Admiral King is certainly no pushover. He was certainly down for a scrap or two. However, so was Jackie Fisher. And when you otherwise compare the two, the thing is, Admiral King looks like the kind of person who could be very angry, and indeed often was, but he looks like he would probably start yelling at you first, then possibly sock you in the face if you kept on being stupid. Admiral Fisher, well, just look at him. Look at any photo of Fisher. You can tell he's the kind of man who would dearly love to skip step one. Also, you know, Admiral Fisher might epitomise British Bulldog spirit when it came to being willing to fight. He's also epitomises British Bulldog genetics in his build. He is just... You can tell he's almost bursting out of the uniform at times. If he hadn't been in the Navy, you probably would have found him as a prize fighter somewhere. So I think just in terms of pure brute physicality, Fisher has a little bit of an edge. Robert Marmerstein asks, in Drydock 160 you mentioned that battlecruisers need more machinery than battleships to achieve higher top speeds. Could you elaborate on this a bit? Do they tend to have more screws, larger engines, more cylinders, etc.? They might use a slightly different type of turbine, depending on the rated maximum power output of said turbine, but for the most part the largest change is in the number of boilers, which that generates the amount of power that gets put through the turbines, because turbines can be run up to a surprisingly fast set of rotations, or they can be geared differently if you want to go a bit faster or a bit slower. And normally, obviously exceptions such as the Nelsons or Bismarck aside, normally most battleships and battlecruisers will have 4 screws. So it's almost entirely boiler numbers, which are then needed to produce the power, which gets, as I say, put into the turbines, which goes into the screws. And this is where all the additional machinery space comes from. Because if you have more boilers, that's going to take up more volume, and therefore your ship is going to need to be longer, even if it didn't need to be longer already, to account for the amount of length to breadth ratio that you need to get an optimal hull form for higher speed manoeuvres. And of course, the amount of power you need to go faster through the water increases a lot more than linearly. It's not exactly exponential, but you could be forgiven for thinking that looking at a graph. So, for example, to use contemporary ships, HMS Iron Duke, which is obviously a battleship designed for 21 knots, used 18 boilers, whereas HMS Tiger, its direct battlecruiser equivalent, which was designed for 28 knots, used no less than 39 boilers. Now, it can be tempting to look at some of the later battleships, like the Queen Elizabeth and Revenge class, and go, well, the Revenge need 18, Queen Elizabeth need 24, and then Hood also needs 24, and you think, well, hang on a minute, but Hood can go a lot faster. But the thing is, you've got to remember, Hood switches to small tube boilers, which have a much greater power density as compared to the large tube boilers on Queen Elizabeth. And likewise, the South Dakota 1920 design battleships for the USA needed 12 boilers, but the initial designs for the Lexingtons needed 24. And so, much greater machinery spaces. Dominic von Bismarck asks, what was the normal process for shipyards designing ships? How many iterations of a plan did they go through, and how often did they outsource the work? It would depend quite a lot on how exactly the shipyard had got the contract for the ship. So, for example, if the Royal Navy had designed a battleship and then they had contracted a private shipyard to build that battleship, then you would literally just roll up with the drawings and say, here you go, shipyard, here's the drawings, get cracking. So the shipyard wouldn't have any major input into the design process. Conversely, you could have a scenario where perhaps the shipyard had been engaged with a government to design a ship, and so the shipyard would have some input, but the shipyard rights of the government in question would also have an input. So there'd be a limited amount of input they'd have, but exactly what ratio would depend on the project in question. So, for example, when the Tashkent, the destroyer that the Soviets ordered, was being designed, it was mostly designed by the Italian shipyards, but there was input from the Russian officers as well. And conversely, in some cases, if a navy wanted a ship design quite strongly, but they weren't sure on exactly how to make it work, then they might go to a shipyard, but then the navy would have most of the input, and the shipyard would just have basically a kind of a quality control and editing process on board. And then, of course, you have private designs. So if a ship is being tendered for, i.e. someone said, we want a ship that's got the following specifications, then a shipyard would go through the entire process, designing the whole thing from scratch, and if there's any minor changes to be made, then the navy in question would probably turn and say, well, okay, I like all of this, but I don't necessarily like this design. Can you go back and rework it? But then the shipyard would still be the one that actually did the rework. A lot of designs in the ironclad era would tend to follow this procedure, because at that point, the sort of invitations to tender will kind of say, well, we want a ship to be armed with X, armoured with Y, speed of Z, and everyone will come back with a design that they thought could actually work. And in terms of the plan, how many iterations you go through, again, that depends greatly on what kind of contract they're under. So if a navy has said, right, we want you to design X ship at Y displacement, with Z armament and armour, etc., then there might be quite a lot of iterations, because they might come up with, okay, well, here's an option that fits within that displacement limit, and it's got, say, good armour, good armament, but it's slow, and here's another option on the same displacement, and this is a bit quicker, but it's more lightly armoured and has a different armament layout. And this back and forth might go on for quite a while. More often, if it's a national shipyard like a Royal Dockyard or something, there'll be a lot more iterations, because iterations are expensive, whereas private shipyards like, for obvious reasons, to get things down as quickly as they possibly can. So when you look at a private shipyard that's, say, advertising a vessel for sale, they might have done 2 or 3 design iterations and then decided, well, this is the best balance we think we can offer our customers, and then it's kind of, well, take it, leave it, maybe make a couple of minor alterations. Whereas if you're talking about something like, say, the design process for the Montana class of battleships, because that's being done in-house, as it were, there can be endless revisions fiddling with everything from displacement to speed to armament to anti-aircraft battery, etc., just to see what might be the best balance of ship. And in terms of outsourcing, I say generally it would either be a national level design process going on within a navy, or it would be done in-house by the shipyard itself, or it would be a balance between the two. The odds of a shipyard privately outsourcing a design to a completely different private contractor, it did happen, but it was very rare. Jonathan Ingalls asks, in The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, James Hornfisher says several times that Admiral Kurita wasn't aware of the true size of Yamato or Musashi's guns. Is this true? Well, I mean, once Admiral Kurita was actually aboard Yamato, it wouldn't take a rocket scientist to work out that maybe these guns are a little bigger than the ones on Nagato. But Japan did have an absolutely insane level of control in operational security over the size of the guns. And remember, officially, the guns were described as 400mm or 40cm special, i.e. Near enough makes no difference, a 16-inch special type gun. Now, okay, perhaps anyone who vaguely understood their history when it came to early World War I and pre-World War I, the British habit of calling everything insert previous caliber here special, and it's actually a bit bigger, maybe could have seen through that one, but maybe they've forgotten it after a couple of decades. So Admiral Kurita, who, bear in mind, up until that point, actually even at the start of the mission, was aboard a cruiser rather than a battleship, there's no particular reason to spread the information beyond the senior planners of the Japanese Navy and the crew who need to operate the thing as to what size the guns actually are. So, I mean, I'm fairly sure that by the time Yamato was actually entering battle, Kurita probably had some idea of the true size and scale of the armament on the battleship he was on, but I would find it entirely plausible that Kurita, who, bear in mind, has come up through the ranks during the war, wouldn't have been on the briefing docket for the actual capabilities of the Yamatos when they were launched, and obviously during the war and up until he was in command of one, there was no particular reason to tell him. Brian Smith asks, how does World War II go if the Japanese attack the Philippines but not Pearl Harbor in December 1941? Does the US still get involved as much as they did historically? Well, it still would have been a surprise attack on US armed forces. There's the US Asiatic Squadron or Asiatic Fleet base there. There's plenty of US AAF aircraft there, and of course US troops. So a surprise attack on the Philippines, okay, it's a little bit more distant, a little bit more remote, possibly a slightly little less impactful than, blowing up half of Pearl Harbor, but it would still be, in Roosevelt's words, a sudden and deliberate attack by the Empire of Japan on United States military forces. So the US is definitely still going to war, and of course Hitler declares war on the USA to support Japan, so that's not really going to change much. But in terms of how does the war go generally, well, if the US still has its battle line, etc., then, and the Japanese are basically ignoring Pearl Harbor in favor of continuing to go after the Philippines, then it's most likely that the US is going to take one look at everything and go, okay, we are still somewhat outnumbered because the Japanese have got the entire Kido-Butai, and even if everything is operational, we've got Lexington, Saratoga, Enterprise and Yorktown, because at this point they won't want to bring in Wasp, they won't want to bring in Ranger. Hornet is still in the process of completing and working up, so they've got 4 fleet carriers plus 2 lesser ones in reserve versus the Kido-Butai, so they're going to play a little bit cagey there. I think they have their island hopping strategy in place, which is good, but they're also going to be looking at what was happening in the run-up to the actual Pearl Harbor attacks, where they're trying to reinforce Wake Island and various other holdings. So I think the initial part of the war will probably consist of more of that kind of thing, i.e. reinforcement missions to go after reinforcing places like Wake Island and Midway, in the hopes of effectively acting as tripwires or blocks to a Japanese advance or a Japanese attack in that direction. And then a lot of it is then going to come down to political pressure, because if the US Navy is able to resist the political pressure from on high and stick to its original plans, then you'll probably start seeing a slow staging of the fleet forward to do more, basically the island hopping campaign, except that perhaps there'll be a big showdown at some point somewhat earlier, because if you've got all these battleships and there hasn't been this devastating air attack, then they may well be tempted to use or deploy them in some way, shape or form in 1942, which may lure the Japanese fleet out. It may just result in them all being attacked by mass Japanese aircraft. Who knows? If political pressure really does start to get to the US Navy, then they may be forced to deploy portions of their fleet over to the southwestern Pacific to try and hold the line there, while the carriers stay a bit more mobile, because bear in mind, obviously, the US does have this idea at this point of the carriers and the battleships being separate scouting forces, or separate forces, the scouting force and the battle force. So the details could be very different, but overall, yeah, the US is still going to get quite heavily involved as it did before. Sina asks, you've said before that being a captain of a frigate and captain of ship of the line requires different approaches. Cochrane seems to have been the frigate captain's captain, and Nelson was successful in charge of frigates, ships of the line, and fleets. Is there any historical figure who was somewhat like Cochrane, but a ship of the line captain's captain? And does being that sort of captain make one good at fleet action? I'd say just because you're good at being in charge of a ship of the line doesn't necessarily mean you'll be any particularly brilliant at commanding a fleet in a fleet action. Because, as I said in the question that you're referencing, that I answered in a previous Drydock, being a ship of the line captain, especially in the Age of Sail, for the most part was more about being able to follow orders and understand your place within the overall context of the battle line than it was about significant amounts of independent thought. However, that was beginning to change towards the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century, with the kind of thing that Nelson was trying to introduce, where he was encouraging his ship-of-the-line captains to think a bit more independently and to act a little bit more off their own merit, although still within the context of following the overall plan. So I'd say in the classic Age of Sail, just being a good ship-of-the-line captain probably doesn't mean you're, by definition, any good at fleet actions. But if you are a ship-of-the-line captain under the Nelsonian Navy, and you're rated by Nelson as one of his good captains of a ship-of-the-line, then you probably will be half-decent at a fleet action, because those kind of people will be, generally speaking, much more capable of thinking for themselves, coming up with plans of action within the scope of an overall objective, and those are the kinds of things, those are the kind of characteristics that you want from a fleet commander. As for a ship-of-the-line captain's captain, well, there's a few examples that you could pick, but I think Admiral Duncan is probably a good one. As compared to a lot of officers, he basically was almost never in command of anything smaller than a ship-of-the-line. His early career, obviously, as a subordinate officer, went up through the standard frigates, etc., etc., but by the time he was actually made captain of anything, he seems to have spent 95% of his career captaining ships of the line, and of course the pinnacle of his career was the Battle of Camperdown, where, he took on a Dutch fleet, which was considerably more capable than, in terms of a ship-for-ship terms, than a Napoleonic-era French fleet, with equal numbers, and still came out on top, albeit with a fairly high casualty list on both sides. So I would say Admiral Duncan, amongst others, would probably be your sort of stereotypical ship-of-the-line captain's captain. Ferris asks, I've always been amused by the fact that, depending on the time period, the word galley can mean either a large sailing vessel with oars or the ship's kitchen and dining area. Did the former term mutate into the other, or was it a case of similar-sounding words coming from different etymologies? I'm not entirely sure on the etymology of galley as in the cooking area. The etymology of galley for the ship, that goes back a lot further and is a lot better attested to, and the use of the term for the cooking area only comes about much later, within the past few hundred years. So, although I can't be definitive, as I say, because I don't know, and I can't really seem to find much about the etymology of the term when it's used for a kitchen or cooking area, I would personally suspect that perhaps, galleys, although they were still around in the 17th, 18th century, they were somewhat less common. And one of the things that they'd become known for over what at that point had been the past few hundred years was, horrible, hot, humid, sweaty, hellish conditions of work because of galley slaves and all of that. So I have a feeling that, especially on a big wooden warship, when you've got the ship's cooking area well underwater, and you've got relatively little ventilation, lots of insulation, and you've got a big fire going, and you're relatively deep down, so there's going to be a reasonable amount of humidity as well. Once a ship's galley fire gets going, that whole area is probably going to become very hot, very humid, and obviously there's an awful lot of work going on to prepare all the food. So maybe at some point along the line, somebody just joked, oh yeah, down there it's like being in a galley. And from that, it gradually just kind of morphed into the ship's galley or something like that. That would be my personal suspicion, although I can't necessarily prove any of it. If anyone else knows the etymology of galley as in the ship's cooking area, please feel free to share in the comments. And finally for this week, Primark 359 asks, I'd love some context on the Iowa's speed. Were they the fastest capital ships ever built pre-1950? Did they ever have to use that speed to its full extent during the war? Or would a 28-knot top speed like North Carolina or South Dakota have been just as good? And how much more dangerous would an Iowa have been to the Royal Navy in Bismarck's place because of those extra 2.2 knots? So yeah, in terms of battleships and battlecruisers, the Iowas were the fastest capital ships ever built. There were obviously smaller ships that were faster than them, but when you're talking about the full-on capital ships, although things like Richelieu come close, the Iowas just about take the speed award. In terms of using their speed to its full extent during the war, yeah, a couple of times, particularly when trying to chase down various Japanese vessels, although it wasn't that common for them to go absolute full bore. So, admittedly, they didn't get a chance to chase down enemy capital ships, so you could make an argument from that perspective that maybe 28 knots they might have done all right. But as well as hunting down fast enemy capital ships like the Congos, which was part of their original design brief, the high top speed of the Iowas meant that they could keep up with the carriers, which was much, much more important. Because the Essex class could make 33 knots and or thereabouts, depending on the ship. And so if you had a 28-knot battleship, then, well, that's a 5-knot speed difference, which is actually a reasonable amount of speed, especially if you're talking about prolonged fly-tops, which would mean that either the battleships would have to go to full speed first and hope that they've chosen the correct course as the carriers gradually overhaul them, or they'd be left behind, or they'd have to take a different course to try and sort of shortcut part to keep up. And all of that had the potential to leave a carrier force vulnerable if a fast enemy force came over the horizon. So the fact the Iowas could just keep pace with the carriers where necessary was a fairly useful feature of that higher top speed. So I think they definitely had a utility by having that top speed over and above a 28-knot vessel. Now, in terms of how much more dangerous an Iowa would be to the Royal Navy in Bismarck's place, the extra couple of knots of speed is not going to make all that much difference to the threat. The threat's mainly going to come from, having more modern and better fire control equipment, because Iowa doesn't come into service until after Bismarck sunk. So it's got later and greater equipment. And of course, more guns, bigger guns, etc., etc. Probably a fire control system that won't die in the first 5 minutes, and various other things. You can make arguments about the various merits of the armour scheme and that kind of thing. So Iowa is just generally a far more dangerous ship than Bismarck. The fact that it's a couple of knots faster, to be honest, really doesn't make all that much difference in the grand scheme of things, because Bismarck wasn't going to get caught by the Royal Navy until it got slowed down by aircraft anyway. So, an aircraft hit that slows down Iowa would be the same kind of hit that historically did slow down Bismarck, and that'll let a theoretical Iowa be caught by the Royal Navy regardless. But then at that point, as I say, all these other factors come into play. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. So the 250k subs competition has now closed. I will be evaluating the entries and hopefully announcing winners in probably a couple of weeks' time, I reckon. Unfortunately, it now is beginning to look very strongly like I will not be able to make it over to the US at all this year. Those of you who've been listening to previous Drydocks, you'll know that I was kind of hoping that they might relax some of the US-UK travel restrictions in late August, early September. It doesn't look like that's going to happen anymore, and to be honest, if they don't do something, and I don't think they will, but assuming that nothing changes in the next 3 or 4 days, then it's going to get to within the time that I would need for a visa application, which would mean that at that point there's no point in doing it, because I might get my visa, but I might get it sort of 4 days after my flight was due to leave, and once you get much beyond this month, I don't think the weather's really going to be worth it. So even if they do lift the travel restrictions in October or November, there's no point in me going this year. I think it's going to be looking at kind of Easter time next year instead. But, you know, it's not all bad. I have managed to do a couple of rather nice field research trips this year to Jersey and Gibraltar, so look out for content on both of those coming up in the near future. Jersey, of course, first, because I went there first. And other than that, just a quick reminder that Tankfest is coming up for those of you in the UK and who can make it. So I will be in the area of Tankfest for the entire duration of Tankfest, and I will advise a little bit closer to the time exactly what days I'm going to be there, but I'm definitely going to be there Saturday and Sunday. I've just not quite decided on Friday or Monday. So with that, I shall bid you adieu. Hope you have a good week, and see you again in another video.